is like not looking good. Anyway, hi, I'm Megan, and I sort of realized that I talk a lot about cognitive functions, but I don't necessarily explain them really well. So I was kind of fired up, kind of thinking about functions, and I thought that it might be beneficial if I just explained all of the cognitive functions right here, right now, and then leave this video up so if there's ever any confusion about how I define cognitive functions, I could just link them to this video in the future. And of course, if there are any questions that you guys have about cognitive functions that you'd like me to get into, just comment below, and then if I see them, you know, we can get going. So anyway, there are extroverted and introverted functions. And the way I see this is that there is energy, right? Some people call this the universe, you know, God, oneness, whatever. And I believe that the 8 cognitive functions is if you divide that into 8, and then that oneness, that the universe that you divide into 8 is then, you know, your mind can attach to those things. So I personally take it a step further of just thinking that cognitive functions is a neural pathway because I am spiritual. If you are not spiritual, you don't have to take it that way. But for me, I think that the neural pathway and the brain patterns of cognitive functions is your mind getting attached to certain energies that represent unity. Altogether, when you put together all 8 functions, is unity, is oneness. And the reason why there's so many miscommunications on the universe or on Earth with people is because we have blind spots, we have functions that we are tapped into, that we use, and that we prefer. We have neural pathways that are in our brain that we use all the time. And so, especially with our blind spots and like with our 8 functions and whatnot, we don't understand where that person is coming from because they're coming from a different part of the brain and a different part of their mind is being used to communicate. And one of the biggest issues that we get into is whenever we assume that the other person is using the same neural pathway as you, or that they're tapping into the same energy as you are. But they're not. They might be tapping into the complete opposite. And sometimes, you know, those opposites can meet in the middle. But anyway, there are extroverted and introverted functions. We all think, feel, sense, and intuit. And you can't, sensing and intuiting is a form of perceiving. Feeling and thinking is a form of judging. And you can't have one without the other. Every time you judge, you're using both feeling and thinking. And every time you perceive, you're using both intuition and sensing. But one of those aspects is conscious, and one of them is unconscious. And so this is where we get into difficulty when we have to remember that feeling in the colloquial sense is not the same thing as feeling in a functional sense. And the same with thinking, and the same with intuiting and sensing. We might think of intuitives, we think of how women have their women's intuition, or like people have a hunch, or, you know, you think of witches or whatever, or psychics, you think of that as intuition. Yes, a lot of them might be intuitive, but it doesn't necessarily mean if you're tapping into another realm. That is something that we all can do. And if you're into metaphysics or spirituality or anything like that, you've probably heard that we are all divine and we all can tap into our psychic gifts. That's not something that is just an intuitive thing, because we all can tap into all aspects of ourselves. But some people default and have a conscious side of them be intuitive, and some have a conscious side of them be the more sensory, bodily experience of life. 80% of people are sensors. That doesn't mean that they're not intuitive. That doesn't mean they don't have ideas. It just means that their conscious self is physical. And for intuitives, your conscious self is conceptual. But anyway, every time you're feeling, you are also thinking. but subconsciously. For feelers, subconsciously when they are talking or whatever, they're probably aware of their feelings, whereas their thoughts are more subconscious and attached to one another. Extroverted feeling is attached to introverted thinking. Extroverted thinking is attached to introverted feeling. Extroverted sensing is attached to introverted intuition. And extroverted intuition is attached to introverted sensing. So I think we kind of understand now how those all work together. Now, what does it mean when I say extroverted? When I say extroverted, I don't mean that someone is super social. When I say extroverted, I am talking about an orientation of feeling, thinking, sensing, or intuiting. A lot of people will talk about like, oh, I'm kind of an extrovert, kind of an introvert. Sometimes I like to stay in and sometimes I like to stay out. That's not what we're talking about when we say extrovert in this sense. What we're talking about is the orientation of your feeling or your thinking. And extroverted in this sense, every single function that we talked about can be extroverted. And that means that it is objective. Extroverted functions are about breadth, and introverted functions are subjective and about depth. These are just really important to understand, the objective versus the subjective. I'm not saying that extroverts are more objective than introverts. I'm saying that extroverted functions operate in an objective way. They operate almost outside of the self in a way that you're observing. Where even judging functions, like extroverted feeling, it's not attached to your feeling. It's attached to the feelings of the whole. It's objective in the sense that it includes all. And extroverted thinking is the same way when it comes to thinking. Whereas every person, their top function is either extroverted or introverted, then their second function is the opposite of that. And so no one is going to be 100% objective or 100% subjective. We all have these different parts to ourselves. And like I said before, you can't use feeling without thinking. And so even if your feeling is objective, your thinking that is subconsciously attached to that feeling is going to be subjective. So it's not like if you're an extrovert, you automatically are off the hook and you're an objective person. Because if you are an extrovert and you're using an extroverted function, then that introverted function that is supporting that subconsciously is subjective. And so see how I mean that you can't even really look at the functions as an individual because it is connected to something else inherently. So objective functions, extroverted functions are objective, and introverted functions are subjective and deep. And introverted functions, people identify with them. That's why they're subjective. It is either, for introverted thinking, it's my opinion. Introverted feeling is my feeling. Introverted sensing is my experience. Introverted intuition is like my ideology, my gut feeling. So all of those things are very personal and subjective. And that's why introverts, in general, if you think of an introverted person, they're really in tune with that part of themselves because their first function is subjective and personal. Introverts know who they are. And that's why we have to really think about, when we're talking about the functions and the archetypes of people, we need to separate the symptom from the root cause. And right now, I'm trying to talk to you guys about the root cause of what these functions are. I'm not talking about what someone who has that function might do. I'm not talking about these functions as something that can do things. Let me know if that makes sense, because I could repeat that if it doesn't. But, yeah, just comment below if that doesn't make sense. Essentially, God damn it, what was I saying? I literally just forgot what I was saying. Hold on. Essentially, I'm not talking about the symptom of what you're doing. I'm talking about what the function is. And it's sort of like if you have a cold, you might have a cough or you might have a runny nose, but you don't necessarily mean, it's not necessarily like, oh, you just have a cough. I heard that the definition of cold was that you had a runny nose, therefore you don't have a cold. That's literally what a lot of your all's arguments sound like when you're talking about functions. And I'm realizing, like, this is like a huge bias that we have, is that we need to think about things as the root and not think about the symptoms that go along with the root if we're really going to talk about what we are, or and what it is and what's going on. Because, for example, introverts might be more likely to stay at home rather than go out. But that's only because introverted functions are focused on their subjective personal side and like to process before they act. It's not because introverts are inherently not liking social situations. It is the function that then creates the manifestation. The definition of the function is not introverts like to stay in. That's a stereotype. The definition is that introverted functions like to process itself fully and deeply before it moves on to the next step. That's all introvert means. So an extrovert is looking at the external world to decide. Extroverted feeling will share its emotions externally in order to sort of decipher what that is. So I'm going to explain each function as its own, but I also want to sort of wrap up on the difference between extroverted and introverted and what it even means applying to the functions and what it even means to talk about each of these other terms. I'm going to get this up just in case there are any comments. So I think we kind of get an understanding of extroverted and introverted right now, and how the stereotypical definitions of going out a lot with friends versus staying in a lot doesn't necessarily apply. This might be a correlation, but it's not a causation. This is what this is the main thing I really want to get to, is that a lot of the definitions that you see online are actually describing correlations and not causations. Oh, ENFPs act like blah, blah, blah. You're describing a symptom of what it is to be an ENFP versus what that even is. So we've got feeling, sensing, intuiting, and thinking. All of those things. You can do all of those things in an extroverted or an introverted manner. So what is feeling? Well, it doesn't mean emotion because we all have emotion. It is, this is really hard. It's really hard to find specific words to use about something that is so esoteric, and every time you use a word, people are going to have their own connotations about what that word means. Feeling is more about values than it is about emotions. And let's just talk about introverted and extroverted feeling. Introverted feeling is about personal values, where extroverted feeling is about the emotional environment and the group value. You have to remember that feelers aren't just going off of they aren't just whining about whatever personal happening to them. Even FI users, it's based on their values. If they're reacting, it's because you crossed something personal and deep to them. Extroverted feeling, it is about taking an objective look at externally what the world values. And it makes these sort of statements that by the way, all extroverted functions sort of seem like sweeping statements because they're so objective and external. Especially FE and TE, they're both going to seem like sweeping statements. Extroverted feeling is value statements that is said as a group fact. That is probably the closest I've ever gotten to the actual definition of extroverted feeling. A value statement, so a statement as like a group value, saying it as if it's self-evident. You can't look at FE and FI and say, oh, this person cries and this person doesn't cry. Those are symptoms. Those aren't the root. That's not the function. Introverted feeling is about processing your values, your emotions. And extroverted feeling is about looking outward and deciding from objective and a breadth of information, deciding a group value and then applying it to yourself. Well, the applying to yourself part is like kind of the TI behind it, but anyway, and let me just see 2 examples. Let's say an FI user is having a political argument and they are debating 2 different points of view, and then the other person calls them a name. And if an FI user has a value that is against calling people names, they're going to turn around and stop talking to you. It's like, do not stop, go. Introverted feeling, based on their personal values, they're just done, essentially. Whereas extroverted feeling, it is also what I'm trying to explain to you is that feeling functions, they're still cognitive functions. It's not like, oh, you're just being emotional about it. These are still pieces of the puzzle. And I feel like a lot of thinkers that are introverted, not introverted, a lot of thinkers that are interested in Myers-Briggs and socionics and stuff, they treat feelers as though their process is not real. Whenever it's a process. It's a piece of the puzzle. While introverted feeling is, like I just explained, extroverted feeling, it's almost like looking at the entire group and deciding what that group collectively values. For example, killing is bad, or lying is bad. And a lot of extroverted feeling value statements won't be as in depth as the introverted feeling, because extroverted feeling value statements are meant to be applied to everyone. The extroverted feeler will have an introverted thinking opinion attached to it about what you should do about it, but the actual value statement is objective. Lying is bad. Killing is bad. Being broken up with is hurtful. These are all like very sweeping statements. Whereas an introverted feeling person would maybe want to be more specific about those things. And, yeah. And so, okay. Thinking. So thinking is going to attach to both of those things. Whereas extroverted thinking attached to introverted feeling is going to exert facts about, that is going to be in connection with those values. So we're talking about objective thinking. So this is like the sort of logical system that is external, and you could spell it out for you. Extroverted thinking spells it out for you in the same way that extroverted feeling will spell things out for you. This is what extroverted judging looks like. And introverted thinking is a very quick and almost a snap judgment, but it's based on the emotional environment information. Okay. Those things are really hard to explain. But, I'm probably going to try again with both of those in a second if some of those didn't make sense. But what I really want you to take away is that these functions, it's like, you know what the word objective means and subjective and extrovert and as long as we know what extrovert means and what introvert means in those connotations, and then we apply them to the function, as opposed to trying to pin down a behavior that goes with that, it is more beneficial to understand what it is and then go let the world be your oyster and observe it. Does that make sense? Because what is objective feeling? I gave some examples. I gave some examples of subjective feeling, and the thinking is the exact parallel of those feelings. Sorry. It's one of those things where this is I'm so close to the fire that it's really hard to go back out and explain. Because I know a lot of you guys are probably looking for very concise definitions that you can just use and then look out to the world and then apply to the definition, but it's just not going to work that way because people are so unique. People have so many different things going on in their lives that you can't apply it to behavior. You have to think of it as part of the brain that is looks at the external emotion or the external logic. And okay, so just to wrap up my thoughts about thinking and logic, is that introverted thinking is more of like an algorithm that is like deep within the brain, and it will make a snap judgment because let's say it'll have X that is missing, and then it'll put the external world, just put it into the equation, and then it'll just pop out. And it'll be kind of a subconscious, like, quick process. Whereas extroverted thinking is a more if this, then why, like very outward. And then it's all about doing things that will then get an output. If their introverted feeling wants a certain output, then they will put in the exact input that will objectively create this output. It's not about what is right or wrong. Introverted thinking is about kind of like what's right or wrong for the external emotional harmony, where extroverted thinking is about how do I get what my introverted feeling wants by what input do I put into this equation, this objective logical equation of life for the output that I'm looking for. So extroverted thinkers are going to be very matter of fact when it comes to if this, then you do this, and then this will happen. Kind of like how FE is matter of factly like killing's bad. Like I don't know. I want to be loved. Oh wow, that's a novel idea. That's kind of how TE is going to be matter of fact in that same way of like you're going to have to work hard in order to succeed, or I don't know, something like that. Whereas okay, so extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. We all use these things, and it's really hard to explain because most people in the typology community are intuitives, and so there's a huge like intuitive bias going on where intuitives will type their friends as all intuitive, even if their friends are actually sensors, because intuitives think that they would only be friends with intuitives, and then sensors that do happen to be interested in this stuff think that they must be intuitives because this is a theory and they're interested in it. But everyone is capable of theory. But what I always like to say is that intuitives, they understand the complex before they understand the simple. And they understand the esoteric before they understand like the physical. So just to explain, introverted intuition, since that is subjective intuition, and what I really want you guys to do is just to sort of view this as like an equation. Like if something is subjective and something is about depth and it's also intuition, then what does that mean? And kind of think about that for yourself. Don't just take my definition and my word for it. Like think of what does subjective intuition remind you of? Well, it reminds me of things like the soul and the soul's purpose in your life journey and what you're meant to do, your destiny, whereas objective and breadth, that's such a hard word to say, of intuition is more about ideas, the universe, being connected with, being connected with all that is. It's not subjective to your specific soul. It's about oneness. So I've noticed that NE users seem to be really fascinated with multidimensional theories and fascinated with different planets, aliens, things like that, because they don't think as much whenever they get into that weird, like woo-woo sort of realm. Extroverted intuitives, they don't just think about their soul and their life path. They're thinking about other dimensions. They're thinking about universal concepts, universal truth, or not truths really, but like universal intuitive concepts. They think about other planets. They think about, well, what if this, what if this, what if that? And they're thinking about not just their personal intuitive experience, their own divine experience. They're thinking about every divine experience. And extroverted intuition will sort of cross-reference different. It's almost like they're in different dimensions at once. And every idea they have, they think about the different possibilities, the ways it could play out, like every single one. They don't look at, oh, well, I'm in this dimension right now, and I'm in this body right now, and this is my life path right now, and so this is what I should do right now, like an introverted intuitive would. Extroverted intuition is more about everything, every possibility you could ever imagine. They don't narrow down to the specific depth of possibilities in the way that introverted intuition does. Extroverted intuition does not discriminate against ideas. And this could be good or it could be bad. An extroverted intuitive probably was the one to say that there are no such thing as a dumb question. There's no such thing as a bad idea. They just want to get those ideas out. They are not connected to those ideas. They're not married to those ideas. They're just throwing them out there. Whereas an introverted intuitive is going to pick what ideas, it is going to be subjective to them. They are going to get attached to ideas, and those ideas are going to like come from the soul. And I like to think of it, my last metaphor I'll say here, is I think of it as extroverted, like I think of it as like a tree. There are the branches and the roots. An extroverted intuition, it starts at one point, like the tree, and then it goes out to the roots, out to the branches, and it's like this idea, like let's say we're talking about red, the color red. Extroverted intuition is like blood, hearts, my favorite hat, this, what about that, like everything that you could think of based on this one thing, which, like I said, it's attached to introverted sensing, and so one introverted sensing thing can branch out and bloom out into a million ideas. Whereas introverted intuition, it looks at all these ideas and it funnels it down into one main idea. But that doesn't mean that introverted intuition's ideas don't move. It's not like they're super stuck. That's actually introverted sensing that can get stuck on one idea, because it's that piece of extroverted intuition thinks about things in puzzle pieces, almost. Every single SI detail is a different puzzle piece. And where introverted intuition, it thinks about the main idea and then it goes along that path. It is a subjective path, and it's always one step ahead. It's very futuristic, and it is a very subjective experience of divinity, and very in tune with what your own signs are saying and your own synchronicities and all those sort of things. You've probably heard this written somewhere before, but introverted intuitives are likely to have those sort of aha light bulb moments where all of those things that they've been picking up from the external sensing world finally connect, and they finally get it, and it's like, oh, that's what it is. Extroverted intuitives don't like to say this is what it is, because they are always leaving up the room for another possibility. They don't attach to their ideas. They're objective. They're about the breadth of ideas. They don't want to pick one. That's hard for them. Whenever they do pick one, they pick an introverted sensing aspect. They don't pick an introverted intuitive aspect. So, I don't know if that made sense, but I'm going to keep going to extroverted sensing and introverted sensing. This is about experience. Is it a subjective experience or is it an objective experience? Extroverted sensing is objective experience, and extroverted sensors are very in tune with the objective energy that exists. Whereas introverted sensors, they think about things in terms of their past experiences and their subjective experiences. You have to just think right now that every single introverted function is going to be colored with an aspect of the individual, and it's going to be like a little bit tainted. That's kind of what subjective means. So we need to get away from thinking that STs are the practical ones, or that sensors are practical, or that thinkers are objective. That's just not how it is. An introverted sensor is going to not see the sensory world in the objective way because they are an introverted sensor. An introverted sensor, an SJ, might even see the world less, like see the physical world, even though they're a sensor, they're going to see it less objectively than an NJ, even though an NJ is an intuitive. Because when you're looking at the physical world, what is actually going on? What is the reality? Extroverted sensing views that as objective. They just look at what's going on, and then they have their own introverted intuition impression about what that means to them, to their soul. Whereas extroverted intuition, they have a very subjective idea of what's going on, but they think with their extroverted intuition that it could mean anything. I hope that makes sense. Introverted sensing is very, both sensing aspects can be in tune with their body, but introverted sensing can be pretty in tune with their body and of their sense, of their five senses, and subjectively, is this too hot? Is this too cold? Whereas extroverted sensing is it cold? Is it warm? Or no, not even that. Like, extroverted sensing would be like, it's 70 degrees. And introverted intuition would decide what that means to them. But introverted sensing will say like, too hot, too cold, too crowded, things like that that are subjective to them, but still about the physical experience. I hope that this makes sense. This is a lot, and I'm gonna reiterate this one more time. All of these functions don't have clearer definitions really than that. Like, I think it's fun to think about how these functions manifest themselves. But NE is not the zany function. FE is not the compassionate function. FI is not the selfish function. SE is not the shallow function. TI is not the judgmental function. Like, we need to get out of this. If we ever want to understand one another, we have to get out of this box. We have to look at the functions as what they actually are and then observe the ripple effect of what's going on because of that function. We cannot just continue to define people, especially based on how we experience things and looking at someone from that lens. And I think the reason why this pisses me off so much as an ENFJ is that I'm an extroverted feeler and an extroverted sensor. And so I'm looking at the objective physical world as it is, and then I have a strong impression about whether that's good or bad, according to my view. And I know whether or not things, okay, this is a good way to explain extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling thinks about, is this conducive to world peace or harmony? Is this action going to bring us together or tear us apart? That's kind of what it looks at. And it doesn't matter how I feel about it. What matters is this actually going to bring about collaboration and harmony and things like that? So, I think that, yeah, like, because I am an ENFJ, I get stressed out about these things because I feel like there's a lot of SI users that have attached specific words to functions as their definition that don't really belong there. It is really their impression of what that is. And I understand I have my own subjective impressions too, but my impressions are like, oh, NE makes me feel either inspired or overwhelmed depending on the day. That's my impression. That's subjective. That's an introverted intuitive impression. It's not an impression based on any sort of sensory means. An introverted sensing impression that would be subjective would be like saying, oh, I know that FE users care more about what people think because, or, I don't know if that even made sense. I feel like I'm getting a little bit too into the weeds here, but I hope that this was a nice overview of what these functions are, and I hope that you can understand that when we talk about the 16 archetypes, there are 2 of these functions that they prefer and are very conscious. So for me, FE and NI are what I use, which are super conscious for me. But then SE and TI are in my unconscious, but you're going to still see them just as much, almost, because they support my FE and NI. That's why it can be hard to tell the difference between an ESTP and an ENFJ, for example, because they use the same functions. Whenever all you see, okay, you're going to see the extroverted functions from people because their introverted functions don't really come out to play much. You're going to have to, it's just a lot easier to look at the extroverted functions as signs of the introverted. And I mean, once you start to understand the functions as what they are, then you can start to make some observations and sort of see some patterns, but just please don't make strong definitive statements when based on a very specific definition, because that's not accurate. And we all get to live our life. I want this in this group or on my YouTube if I post this to YouTube later. This is a safe space for people to be themselves and for people to discover their functions and to discover other people's functions. And making bold statements about what a function is and saying everyone in this archetype or who uses this function will do this is not really gonna help people understand, and it's not really always accurate because people are conditioned to act in ways to either please the people around them or to do their job correctly at work. We all have an inherent archetype. That does not mean that we can't use or aren't forced to use other functions in order to make life a little easier for us. Each country even has their own sort of ideal personality type. I'd say that, in the United States, it's pretty easy for STJs or NTJs to get ahead. I don't know what it's like in other countries. I'm Italian American, and from what I understand, Italy seems to have a lot of FE in their culture. But different cultures will sort of put certain personality types on a pedestal, and you might be conditioned in different ways that, so you might feel like you have to bend yourself in certain ways. But I mean, I want this group to help people be themselves and not feel like they have to bend for anyone else. And, that's what I'm gonna continue to share for each type examples that I think fit that type, so that I want people to understand that not all manifestations of FE are going to look the same. And if you're typing people based on, oh, well, they're an idea person, or, oh, well, they care what people think, or, oh, well, the way they share their emotions, you have to understand what the functions are. And, okay, this is going to sound really douchey. I don't really know how else to say it. The way I view these functions is almost like something like gravity. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it's like someone had to discover gravity, someone had to discover numbers, someone had to discover math equations, and I feel like these functions is a phenomenon that exists. It's not just a theory, it's not just a test. It's real, and these functions are real, and Myers-Briggs and socionics are just two different ways of describing it. Sort of reminds me of how I view spirituality, and how I think that different religions is different manifestations of divinity that was translated through different cultures. So I know that some of you might not agree with that, but the different definitions that we have, it's fine. We all can think. We can disagree on oh, well, I think that NE users are more likely to do this, and I think that FE users are more likely to do this or have a tendency to do this. That's fine. We can all disagree on those sort of things, but as long as we are really trying to hit the nail on the head when it comes to what these things actually are, and recognizing that people act differently depending on their life experience and what's expected of them, and also based on other aspects of their personality, based on their Enneagram, or based on their astrology, if you believe in that, or based on, might be other personality types that already exist or that are yet to be discovered that have an impact on them that is something completely different than this. This is not the end-all be-all. And I'm a person, I'm trying to figure out where to go with my videos and with things like this. I appreciate those of you who are still listening at this point. And if you are listening at this point and you have any advice for me, please let me know. But I'm sort of at the point where I'm not a person who likes to source what I'm saying to other sources when the other source was another human being, then sourced who? The Myers-Briggs Foundation, another human being, who then sourced Carl Jung, another human being. I want to source myself. I've read things, like I know what these functions are, I notice them in people, and I'm going to continuously make content about this and explain each type more as I've been doing on my YouTube, but I don't want to feel like I have to always be explaining myself, and I know that a lot of that is because I put it on myself, because I care about making sense to everyone, but I just don't want to source things that I believe. Like, I want to be my own source, because everyone, like, at the end of the day, it all comes back to every single authority of information. It all goes back to a person who believed in themselves enough to say it. Carl Jung believed in himself enough to say it. Where did he get his source from? You know, like, Socionics sourced Carl Jung, and then they also came up with some of their own stuff that he didn't say. And then other people on YouTube, they source Socionics. Well, you know, like, I don't know. And I feel like I'm kind of a philosopher sort of person in that sense, that I'm coming up with my own, and I'm showing you guys my thought process as I'm going. And I don't know, I probably just need to be a little easier on myself with this, because I guess I feel like people are judging me, or they care, or like they think I'm dumb if I can't explain myself perfectly. But I don't know. I am telling you, I am reacting to what I see and what I believe, and it's coming from the heart, and I hope that you guys can feel that, and I hope that you guys like that. And the more things I discover about this system, I want to keep sharing with you. And I am not here, I'm not here to regurgitate information. Like, I am about saying things that haven't been said. And yeah, some of this has been said, and it's also sort of like what is in common of all. Okay, my like NI and TI will look at what is the common source of all of these writings that I've seen. Because all of these things I've seen are symptoms. Well, some of them are hitting the nail on the head, but a lot of these things that you see written about the types are actually describing symptoms. So I'll look around and I'll see all these symptoms, and I'm like, what could be the common thread behind all of these things that you might agree with or you might not? Because you have to realize that we all have biases. An FE user is going to write all of the functions down, and there's going to be a bias about what FE and NI is. I guarantee you that, thank you. I guarantee you that all of these descriptions, I bet I'm a little bit kinder to FE and NI, and I bet that SI and TE I didn't explain correctly all the way. Want to know why? Because I don't use those functions, okay? And you realize that every single person that writes a description is going to be bound by their own experience in that way. And so it's literally impossible to get an objective view on that. So we have to be open to other people's points of view. And yeah, we got to be open to discovering it, because I know that I've got more to learn about SI and TE. I know more about what SI and TE is not than what it is. I know what it's not because I see what it's not, because I see their bad FE and NI. But I know that it is something too that I just am kind of blind to. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that this starts a discussion. And if there is any other more specific questions that anyone has that you would like a different video to, please let me know. All right, thank you, and have a great night.